Mari Extension Pack 6 adds a new generator node to Mari that further enhances Extension Pack's range of options to create complex patterns. The new circular pattern generator creates complex patterns and splatter effects based around a system of circles and rings, and is available both in UV-based and triplanar modes. Here in this time-lapse, you can see just some of the effects you can create with these nodes. We will deep dive into the numerous settings and controls in this video. The controls can get a bit overwhelming, and even as the developer of these nodes, I still haven't scratched the surface of what looks you can achieve. The two new nodes, Circular Pattern Generator X1 2D and Circular Pattern Generator X1 Triplanar, are part of Extension Pack's pattern engine. The pattern engine is a group of both Uber nodes as well as stripped down versions of these nodes. These stripped down versions are more lightweight and tailored to specific tasks, such as splattering textures or creating symmetrical patterns. As part of the pattern engine, the new circular pattern generators share many parameters with, for example, the main pattern engine node, which is just called pattern generator. So learning one will give you a good idea how the others work. But regardless, there are detailed tutorials on the other pattern generator nodes available as well. As is the case with all pattern engine nodes, they are very expensive to calculate live. So once you have achieved a look you like, it is recommended to either convert them to a paintable node or put them behind a breakpoint. But enough talk, let's finally dive headfirst into the many parameters of these circular pattern generators. When you first create a circular generator, this is what you will get. In the amount group, you can adjust the number of cells per ring as well as the ring count. The repeat options just act as simple UV repetition factors. The ring controls group provides some useful overrides for pattern amounts in different iterations of each subsequent ring. The per ring offset will apply the specified value as an incremental offset to the pattern amount of each ring. So if I set my pattern amount to 10 and my amount offset to -2, this inner ring will have 2 cells less. The add subtract ring amount, on the other hand, will multiply the provided values in this field by the ID number of each ring and add or subtract it to the amount of pattern cells. If I take on the implicit per ring amounts, the pattern amount setting in the main amount group will no longer have any effect. And instead, for the first 7 rings, you can set an individual start pattern amount. The offset features, on the other hand, still work with this, so they're not being overridden. The pattern group is largely identical to other pattern engine nodes. You can set a shape type here, or switch to a custom input image that you can define in the input image group down here. If you are using procedural shapes, the pattern specific sliders allow you to add modifications to these shapes. However, not all shapes have modifiers, so for some of these sliders won't have any effect. The pattern-specific sliders can also be overwritten with ports on the node, so if you want to use a node chain to control this, you can by plugging it into one of those ports. The pattern size, rotation, and pattern alpha intensity also only have an effect on procedural shapes, with the pattern alpha intensity defining the pre-multiplication of the alpha on procedural shapes. So basically how much half-transparent gradients you see in softer shapes. The pattern repeat allows you to repeat your chosen shape or image within each generated cell, which is different than the global repeat in the amount group, which repeats the entire result of the node computation. The blend mode defines how each cell blends with underlying cells. So for example, if I switch this from lighten to normal, you can see those cells don't blend anymore. However, in this case, I could play with the pattern alpha intensity slider to get a nicer soft blend in between these cells again. Next, we have a group of edge controls for each cell, all of which can be mapped as ports on the node as well. The edge falloff will apply a soft linear falloff to the alpha of the image or shape you're using. while the edge softness determines the length of the falloff. The edge roundness controls if the falloff happens in a square or round manner. On these sliders, as on any other slider, you can manually go past the hard limits of the sliders by just entering a value. We skipped over the edge distortion slider. Let me quickly switch some things around here to show the effect of this. As you can see, we have a fairly defined corner or edge for each cell. If I increase the edge distortion over 0, these cells will be blended around the edges based on dark values. If I lower the value below 0, these cells will then be blended based on light values. As the last two items in this group, we have the pattern rotation options. These are settings to pre-rotate your pattern or image, or random rotate each instance in 90-degree increments. If you want to apply crops to your pattern, you can do so via the pattern crop options here. I find myself rarely using those, but it can be useful to create even more variants of procedural shapes, like here for example. We already discussed the input image group before, but again, just for clarity, in order to use an input image in the node, you need to set the pattern up here to its first entry. The input image can also be procedurally applied by the so-called breakpoint image port of the node. In order to have a node chain transferred into this image slot, you need to apply a breakpoint node between whatever node chain you want to use and the breakpoint image port. Now I can just hit bake inside the breakpoint and the image will update. However, I actually find myself using the reload paint option here in the menu instead, which will also pull the final image in. Why am I using this one instead? Well, this option ensures that you're always baking the full UV tile of the incoming node chain, while the normal bake button on the breakpoint in this case would bake against the model UVs, which might cause weird seams or artifacts. So just to avoid any of this to begin with, I use the reload paint, which is also on the hotkey Ctrl and F5. Going back to our attributes, inside the input image group, we can blur the image, adjust how any alpha should be created or interpreted, and if you're using a normal map, what format the normal map is in. This is important to set for normal maps in order to have correct normal recalculation when you rotate them, for example using any of the nodes rotation or random rotation options. If this is not set, otherwise the normals will be incorrect and no longer accurately reflect the direction your lighting is coming from. Now that we covered all of those utility groups dealing with images and patterns, let's finally get down to some of the transformation controls that really are where the true variety of looks come from that the node can produce. In the position group, we can adjust the radius of the rings here. But hold on, something is missing. Let me quickly step back up to my amount group and increase the UV tiling. And we can see the issue. By default, the node will not produce a tiling result when pattern cells are pushed outside of the 0.1 UV range. We can rectify this by ticking on this tiling checkbox. However, the label on this checkbox containing expensive is not just for fun. Ticking on the tiling option greatly reduces the speed of the node, and the more pattern cells and rings you have, the worse it gets. You can see that down here in the viewport FPS, that when the tiling option is on, my FPS count just really takes a nosedive. That being said, for some patterns we just have to bite the bullet, so let's leave it on for now. Our spread allows us to define how the pattern should be spaced around the circumference of each ring, while the random spread randomizes this value per ring. The explode rings and random explode rings will move the distances between each ring. Now you might be thinking, hey, the explode rings function looks much more random than the random explode rings. And you're right to a point. However, if I change the global seed value up here, you can see with just the explode rings turned fully on, the look doesn't really change. If however I raise the random explode rings and change the seed, then the look does change. So you can see the random part of the attribute label is not a naming mistake. Now the rest of the position group should be fairly straightforward, with the ability to create spirals as well as global UV offset options. So let's move on to the scale group, where things are also pretty self-explanatory, so we'll just glance over those settings quickly as well. We have a whole bunch of ways to uniformly and non-uniformly scale things, and I'll leave it to you to try this out. But just a quick tip that I mentioned before, that it can be useful to try manually enter the values outside of the slider range. For example, here on the scale by pattern number, if I enter a negative value, I get an entirely different result. So it's worth exploring. In the rotation group, we have a global UV rotation. The rotation pivot can be moved from the UDIM center to the 0 coordinate of the UDIM, just by unticking this center global pivot checkbox. Same for the local cell rotation, which rotates by default around the center of each cell, following the curvature of the ring. When I untick the local rotation center checkbox, the rotation behavior changes and the position the pattern stamp is at on the ring no longer has an influence on the rotation. We then have a bunch of different options for random rotation per pattern and per ring, as well as ring rotation offset, which applies an incremental offset value to each ring. If I set this to 0.5, the first ring will stay unaffected. Then the second one gets a 0.5 offset, the third one 1, the fourth one 1.5, etc. Next, we have some masking. So our probability masking randomly hides cells, while the shape masking forces the distribution of cells to stick to a given masked area. So this concludes all these settings to control the general shape of patterns. What's left are some color controls and settings for the additional ports of the node. The fill background checkbox determines if the pattern is generated on top of this background color or on top of the background fed into the node via the background port. When we turn the background off, you can once again see the current lack of pre-multiplication in the beauty render, which you can control via the pattern alpha intensity slider in the pattern group. Our tint is an overlay that I'm just going to quickly apply here to show off some of the U randomization features in the next group. In the randomization group, you have all sorts of controls, for example, to randomize luminance, saturation, hue, but you can also apply transitions based on ring numbers and pattern numbers. To wrap this up, let's quickly look at the output alphas group and the extra output ports of the node. All of those sliders here only affect the extra output ports and have no bearing on what you see on the main output. So for example, the alpha clip value sets the minimum alpha channel value that is still evaluated. You can see if I change that, for example, my UV output changes. The UV output I can use to drive other nodes with the UVs of the pattern node. So let's create a tiled node, plug in the UV output into the manifold port, and here we have our image applied in a circular manner. I could also mask this out by directly plugging the pattern mask output into the mask port of this node. Finally, let's use our output random to reapply some random values to this. If instead of the UV output, I use the pattern manifold output, I get a single value per cell instead, which can be useful for stylization effects. Alright, this wraps this tutorial. I hope you got something out of it despite its length. In the end, you will have to experiment with these nodes to find what works best. And of course, don't forget to put them behind a bake point when done, cache them or flatten them, since they do take quite some calculation and can have an impact on your scene performance.